Muraho,
Hoi.
Olá.
ahlan wa sahlan.
Ahoy.
Sveiki.
Привет.
Hello.
Ciao.
Salut.
Hello.
And welcome to Policy Voices by Friends of Europe, an independent think tank with a difference. Each week from Brussels, we bring you powerful conversations with policy voices from around the world. Policy Voices talking policy choices.
There was not really anything greatly new, as you mentioned, Catarina, when it came to NATO admitting Ukraine as a member. We were still pretty much at the same situation as last year in Vilnius. We have to wait for the war to be over. Who knows when that's going to be the case? Allies have to agree. That's not yet the case. Ukraine has to meet conditions. And what was clear before the summit is that those conditions are still pretty severe. For example, the Americans were talking about more in terms of judicial reform, fighting corruption, not just military transformation, but political transformation too. And it's not clear just how much of that political, economic sort of stuff Ukraine can do while the war is going on.
Hello and welcome to Policy Voices, Friends of Europe's weekly podcast on European and global affairs. I'm your host, Catarina Vila Nova. The success of last week's NATO Summit in Washington was mostly due to management of expectations. The Ukrainian president already knew not to expect a formal invitation to join the military alliance and had to content himself with knowing that Ukraine's path to NATO's membership is irreversible. With that in mind, the summit was a success, even if overshadowed by a possible Trump return to the White House and Biden still trying to prove he's up for the job. Also looming large was China's military exercises with Belarus right outside NATO's border. To help me unpack all this and more, I spoke to Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow for Peace, Security and Defense at Friends of Europe, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Here's our conversation. So, Jamie, let's start talking about the conclusions of the NATO summit in Washington. The members, the allies, agreed that Ukraine's membership in the alliance was irreversible. We've heard this before. Indeed, Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, when he was in Friends of Europe, he already used this word. So it's not something new something that we haven't heard yet. The allies also agreed to provide 43 billion US dollars in military assistance next year, started the transfer of F-16 fighter jets, and are also sending dozens of air defenses, including 4 Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. Can you put these achievements into context for us? How significant are they?
There was not really anything greatly new, as you mentioned, Catarina, when it came to NATO admitting Ukraine as a member. We were still pretty much at the same situation as last year in Vilnius. We have to wait for the war to be over. Who knows when that's going to be the case? Allies have to agree. That's not yet the case. Ukraine has to meet conditions. And what was clear before the summit is that those conditions are still pretty severe. For example, the Americans were talking about more in terms of judicial reform, fighting corruption, not just military transformation, but political transformation too. And it's not clear just how much of that political, economic sort of stuff Ukraine can do while the war is going on. But there was a change of mood, because last year in Vilnius, Zelensky was extremely frustrated at this lack of progress. He even threatened at one stage not to go to the NATO summit. This year he was much more smiling, happier. I think this reference in the communicator, irreversible path to membership, helped. But he was also informed well in advance. For example, when he came to Europe for the D-Day commemoration and met Biden, that Ukraine was not going to get membership. And frankly, the situation this year was very different from last year. I mean, last year, the Ukrainians were on the offensive. There was hope the war would come to an end soon. They felt that, the membership would happen quickly. This year, of course, it's a much worse situation for Ukraine, with Russia on the offensive, capturing villages, threatening Kharkiv. And so Zelensky, frankly, was less interested in the membership question. He knew it wasn't going to happen. And he was much, much more interested in securing those weapons, that financial assistance that you mentioned, which he needs urgently to turn the tide, to turn the situation around. And in this respect, yes, I think Zelensky had a good summit. There was the financial package of 43 billion. There were the Patriots you mentioned. The Spanish handed over more Leopard tanks, for instance. Norway handed over six extra F-16s. The Americans, the Dutch, the Danes announced that the F-16s would be arriving in the next few weeks. The Poles agreed to set up a big training center in Poland, hopefully training those Ukrainian men who are outside the country, but who now come under the new Ukrainian conscription law. We'll see how successful that's going to be. So all in all, Zelensky didn't go back to Kiev empty-handed. Indeed, 23 countries now, including non-NATO countries, have signed these bilateral security arrangements with Ukraine, which total $35 billion if they're sort of all achieved. And then we could also talk about this big initiative that NATO announced at the summit, where it's going to play a much more central role in coordinating the training and the military assistance to Kiev out of Wiesbaden in Germany, which will be set up over the summer. We'll have to wait to see just how big a difference that really makes.
I want to stay with that. Is that, there's a lot of talks, and I'm getting a bit ahead of the interview already, but there's, a lot of talks about Trump-proofing the alliance. It seems almost like a fait accompli that Trump will become a US president again. What you just mentioned in Germany, is this an example, a very practical example of what the alliance is already doing to prepare itself for a new Trump presidency?
Well, yes, to some degree, by putting more of the emphasis on NATO, using the NATO structures, the NATO command structure. The current arrangement, the Ukraine Support Group, of course, is run by the United States and chaired by the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. But my sense is that in reality, not much is going to change, because this US-led NATO support group stays, the Ramstein group as it's often called, with over 50 countries as the kind of supervisory body. Secondly, NATO is using an American base, the Lucius Clay Kaserne in Wiesbaden. It's an American facility where, again, the United States will be providing, I would imagine, 50% of the personnel. NATO will build on the current American logistics system for receiving the weapons and for sending them onwards into Ukraine. The Americans, of course, will provide a lot of the money for all of this, and therefore, if Trump did pull the plug after November, even if NATO has taken a lot of this over, if the United States simply stops cooperating with this or pulls out altogether, it's not going to be very easy for the remaining NATO members to take it over. So I don't think there is any such thing as absolute Trump proofing. But it's still good that, in Washington, the European allies were pointing out that they're now spending a lot more money on defense than when Trump was in the White House last time. At that time it was about 5 allies. Now, as we know, it's 23. Even Canada did something in Washington that it's never done before, which is to commit to an actual date to reach the 2% target, although it's not for another 10 years, but still. And also pointing out to the United States that a lot of this extra money that the Europeans are now spending on defense is going to American defense contractors. They produce the Patriots. They produce, the P-8 Orion maritime patrol aircraft, and all of these are kind of things. Maybe one of the good signs, though, is that there were announced in Washington a lot of bilateral European-American joint ventures. For example, between MBVA, a European missile consortium, and Raytheon, for instance, or other joint ventures on 155mm ammunition. And therefore, to the extent that the US defense industry and the European defense industry start cooperating, that really gives the American business community a much bigger interest in sustaining the NATO alliance. And Republicans are very business minded, Catarina, as you well know. But at the same time, yes, what was interesting last week in Washington was a lot of European officials were meeting with Kevin Kellogg, a general who is an advisor to Trump, all ready to start trying to figure out a little bit more about what Trump might have in mind and to try to influence him. But I'm not totally pessimistic, because on the margins of the summit, a lot of senior Republicans gave speeches about NATO, like Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And they were, not totally uncritical when it came to Europe must do more, but they were very, very supportive of the alliance. And to the extent that the Republican Party sticks with NATO and the American business community sticks with NATO, that, Trump can't ignore these things altogether. And I think that will sort of limit his margin of maneuver to do sort of radical things like stop cooperating with NATO or to pull American forces out of Europe. But still, you're right, there's a question mark, and we don't really know. We'll have to wait for November.
You seem to be very optimistic, cautiously optimistic. Do you see it as I used this expression before, fait accompli, that Trump will become president? Are you on the side of debate of let's wait and see still?
We had, of course, since the summit, this assassination attempt against Trump, which has completely seized the headlines. And of course, things were not looking so great for Joe Biden at the time of the summit last week because of the debate performance and questions about his age and his health. But still, American opinion polls overall show that Biden is still ahead of Trump, 52%, 48%. Despite, the questions about his age. Biden clearly is fighting back. Trump's a fighter, but Biden is a fighter too. He's not giving up. We see with, all of Biden's current sort of TV appearances, he's going to have another debate with Trump, which could go a lot better for him next time round in September. But the real big issue, if you look at American politics, is these swing states, the Wisconsins, the Pennsylvanias, and so on, where, yes, Trump seems to be pulling ahead. But the election is in November, and in all elections, Catarina, including the ones in Europe, people really only make up their minds who they're voting for in the last week or so, if they're not already pre-committed. So I'm not writing Biden off just yet.
Let's talk about China. In NATO, in Washington, with European leaders gathering there, with the American leaders gathering there, of course, it's all with the idea of Russia. It's more than ever, it's these two world systems that are opposing each other, democracy versus authoritarianism. But then, of course, there's China, and China had also a very strong reaction against this. It's been trying to play almost in both sides of the field, successfully, not successfully. How do you see China in this chess game?
Well, China featured quite heavily in this NATO summit. I suppose it was inevitable because NATO was in Washington. And of course, if you're in Washington, every time they mention Russia, they mention China 10 times. So clearly, NATO couldn't stay silent if it wanted to demonstrate its relevance to Americans, particularly Republican Congressmen and women. It couldn't stay silent on China, and it didn't. And there was a kind of turn of the screw by NATO in Washington by really calling out China in a very critical way for the military assistance that it's been giving to Russia to fight the war in Ukraine. There's been in the last couple of months growing evidence, from the intelligence community that Russia is now getting about 70% of its machine tools and 90% of its sort of critical electronics. Rare earths, critical components for missiles and for military production from China, loans from Chinese banks and so on. And in the eyes of many US officials and some NATO officials, basically China is fueling Russia's war in Ukraine. And if China stopped this supply, which is not likely, but if it did, Putin would need to stop his offensive within a matter of days. So this has meant that NATO has now used a new phrase, a decisive enabler, I quote, in criticizing China. And therefore, China predictably reacted very negatively against NATO, accusing NATO of Cold War mentality. Wang Yi, the foreign minister, of sowing chaos in the world, and the rest. I also think that the more sour mood vis-a-vis Beijing also came about because in a couple of days before the summit, the Chinese carried out this exercise in Belarus, very close to NATO's border with...
They called it an anti-terrorism exercise.
Well, all exercises by Russia are called anti-terrorism exercises, although when you look at actually what goes on, there are not many terrorists, and there's not much evidence that that's the case. They're much more classical military exercises. But most Chinese exercises in Europe have been maritime exercises in international waters, far away from sensitive borders. But a land exercise close to a NATO border with a Russian ally, that was seen as a kind of a new step, which the alliance is still analysing. And there was also China's refusal to show up in Bergenstock in Switzerland last month for the Ukraine Peace Summit, although China always claimed that it was neutral and wanted to serve as a peacemaker. So yes, there's no doubt about it. The mood has become more sour, although Wang Yi did say in a telephone conversation with the Dutch foreign minister that, despite obviously his irritation with the NATO criticism, and the NATO Secretary General also called out Beijing over Taiwan, over the oppression of its people, etc. Nonetheless, he was still open for dialogue with NATO. We'll see if Stoltenberg meets him at the UN General Assembly in New York in September, as they've done in the past. NATO has had these military-to-military talks with the Chinese, and so we'll see. If NATO and China, notwithstanding as I say, this more sort of tense atmosphere, still manage to keep some kind of conversation going on, if only about confidence building, transparency, and the rest. But after the summit, Catarina, you still get the impression of the world dividing into two blocks. Yes, clearly there's a NATO perception now that it's not just dealing with Russia, but it's dealing with Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. They're a package. You can't think of one without the other three. And the way in which NATO and the 4 Asia-Pacific countries in Washington, NATO's partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, came closer together too on Ukraine, on many other things, really does suggest, these two sort of big groups, increasingly coming sort of closer together as they face off against the others. Whether you want to call it authoritarians versus democracies, maybe that's a little bit too simplistic, but still, yeah, this was not a summit about global reconciliation. Far from it.
Absolutely. It feels, for those who studied international relations, that we're just being taken back to the second half of the 20th century, where the world is divided in two blocks. But in terms of policy and Western policy towards China, do you see that what the West is doing now, openly criticizing China, that of course, they claim they are a neutral ally partner, I don't even know what to call them in this war. But this policy of being very upfront and attacking China is the right way to go, especially when it tries to, as NATO tries to bring in allies, in the Asia Pacific, that I know China is, of course, very defensive about. You see, is this the right policy, or is it just consolidating and enforcing this binary world that we're living in?
Well, I certainly think that there is a sense of reducing all dependencies on China now. What happened with Russia was that Russia invaded Ukraine, and then the West, the Europeans, Germany, energy, gas, and so on, raw materials, fertilizers, uranium, in a whole lot of areas, nickel. Suddenly, the West, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, had to sort of reduce its dependency very quickly, very painfully, and find alternative supply lines. What you see going on a bit now is a sense that, before any future, God forbid, but any future confrontation that could occur between the US or China, or the West or China, and now a sense of reducing vulnerabilities and dependencies. For example, in Washington, there were some voices, and European as well as American, saying, well, look, we need to repossess now some of the infrastructure like ports, energy lines, telecommunications, 5G networks. We need to repossess these and take back the ownership from China, because we don't want to be in a situation of blackmail or dependency in wartime. We need to see how
Same that happened with Russia.
Yeah, exactly. We need to see with the One Belt, One Road initiative, although Italy, for example, which was the one G7 country in it, has now withdrawn under Giorgia Meloni. But we need to see how Russia could, use some of these investments to support Russia We need to look at Chinese banks. The Americans have been calling for secondary sanctions. The US has already imposed a number of so-called secondary sanctions against China, banks, companies, individuals, both in Hong Kong and China, that have been involved in the trade with Russia. Would like Europeans to do the same, follow on now. We'll see how far this goes. This discussion was very preliminary and very inconclusive in Washington, because, for example, France says this is not a NATO job. It's for the EU to look at ownership of companies and rules. How much foreign investment is China allowed to have in which areas, subject to which supervision, and so on. And the Americans are saying, well, it's probably not going to be easy to get a common at 32 NATO sort of agreement on this. So we US negotiate bilateral agreements with allies who, do share our view and who are willing to sort of join us in this. But this is quite interesting. This idea of decoupling. Because so far the word has been de-risking, right? But business with China continues. But now, to what degree this sort of strategic decoupling, which it really is, will be pursued. I think, just one word on this, had the summit been more of a NATO EU dialogue, these issues might have come, resilience and so on, decoupling might have come more to the fore. But von der Leyen didn't go to Washington.
Still busy trying to get a second mandate to be sure that next year she's going to be the one being there.
Yeah, you know that better than I. We're in this transitional period after the European elections, obviously French elections, no new government yet, and so I think this is probably going to be much more of a theme, particularly with Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General from an EU country, the Netherlands, at the helm. Much more of a theme. NATO EU, with the new EU leadership at the next summit in The Hague next year.
Just to note that we are talking on a Tuesday. Von der Leyen is getting confirmed or not in 2 days. So by the time this conversation goes out, whoever's listening to us will know. You just mentioned Mark Rutte. Next year, when the allies meet again, it will be in The Hague, it will be in the Netherlands. It will be in Mark Rutte's home country, so we'll be the one welcoming the leaders and the allies in his own country. What can we expect of Mark Rutte as Secretary of NATO?
Well, he's been keeping a low profile since he was nominated, which is good. Because as I know from my own experience working in the cabinet of previous NATO Secretary Generals, while they're still there, the last thing they want is a kind of Secretary General Mark II. No pun on Mark, the name intended. As one Secretary General I worked for said about his successor, I don't want two Secretary Generals at the same time, please. So, Stoltenberg is still there until the 1st of October. He's obviously a Secretary General very much in command, very much leading. And I think Mark Rutte wisely stayed in the background. He needs time to prepare. So I don't think we're going to have any kind of, this is what I'm going to do, campaign policy speech from Rutte before October. But, when you have a change of leader after 10 years in any organization, there's always a debate. And the debate is, look, we've had this guy with this style for 10 years. Do we want more of the same? So we need to find, another Stoltenberg who's going to basically continue with the same approach, the same style, the same sort of leadership attitude. Or do we really want to go off in a new direction now? We want something totally different. We want to shake things up. And I think the choice of Rutte shows that as far as NATO is concerned, it really is option one. They're happy with the Stoltenberg style, good handling of the Americans, good handling of Erdogan, handling of Orban in Hungary, during difficult times, the Trump presidency. We'll see if there's a second. Erdogan and Orban holding up the membership of Finland and Sweden in the alliance. Stoltenberg had to use a lot of diplomacy behind the scenes to, persuade these sometimes difficult allied leaders to go along and keep everybody on board. And I think Rutte, having led 4 very difficult Dutch coalitions. One of the hardest jobs in politics is to form a Dutch coalition, and the second hardest job in politics is to lead a Dutch coalition. And Rutte's done that for 4 years. So I think they want somebody who, is in that kind of mold. He will be able to keep the family together. He knows about internal diplomacy. He can communicate clearly. He's a safe pair of hands. If Trump is re-elected, at least we've got somebody who last time round, both in the EU and NATO, met Trump, knows the guy, has a relationship, has got some idea about how to handle him. And being a prime minister for 10 years, like Stoltenberg was also prime minister of Norway, really has the address book. He knows everybody. He can pick up the phone. He can sort of sort things out and the like. And so there will be Central and Eastern Europeans who were disappointed it's not somebody from their region, who would have been very assertive vis-a-vis Russia. There are people who also, maybe yourself, Catarina, who felt that it's really time for somebody from the southern region of NATO. Nobody since Javier Solana from Spain a few years back.
We got the council, so.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, you did. I mean, if you look at the EU and Kaja Kallas, of course, coming in as the High Representative, there is a senior woman. But there were many people who also felt, as you know, it was time for NATO to select a woman in the role to present a more sort of modern face. Maybe somebody looking at new challenges like climate change, not just Russia. But I think, at the end of the day, at a time of great geopolitical turbulence, as we say in my country, hold on to nurse for fear of getting something worse. That's an English expression. So I think they really wanted a continuity candidate, and Rutte was the best of the continuity candidates who was out there.
And in the second half of the year, we're seeing very significant leadership changes. So we're looking at NATO, we're looking at your country in the UK, where you after over a decade of conservative leadership, you have a Labour government. So very significant changes of leadership across Europe, across the ocean. We may or may not have a new president in the White House. Will this have any significant impact in the course of the Ukraine war?
You could take a view that there's a sort of paradox in NATO at the moment. If you look at sort of the foreign policy level, the alliance has probably never been as strong as it is today. It's responded to Ukraine very well. Of course, we can argue if what it has done is enough to allow Ukraine to win rather than prevent Ukraine from losing. We'll have to wait and see, especially how effective this new NATO role is. But, it's buttressed conventional defense. It's spending more. The 2% target. There's now talk of going to a 2.5% of GDP spending target.
Or 3% even.
In fact, Radek Sikorski yesterday, the Polish foreign minister, was saying Poland's going to spend 5%. We'll see next year. So, so the way in which NATO's pulled together behind its traditional sort of collective defense role, but also supporting Ukraine, developing new partnerships. You go, oh my God, this is an impressive performance, particularly when you think back just a couple of years ago and the chaotic withdrawal with no transatlantic agreement at all from Afghanistan. But what does worry me is that at a time when externally, in foreign policy terms, NATO is coming closer together, you have, of course, this worry about what NATO represents, which is democracy, liberal values, of course, the liberal international order, the support for that, international cooperation, working together, an unselfish approach that, your safety is my safety. By helping you, I'm helping myself. NATO is not an alliance based on nationalism. Quite the reverse, and therefore the paradox could be that at a time when it seems so successful externally, you could get political instability in a number of countries. You could get firebrand governments of the left or the right. Look at France, where Jean-Luc Mélenchon wants to be prime minister. Doesn't look likely, right? Of La France Insoumise, but he's much more radical when it comes to pulling out of NATO than even the Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen is. So far, you could argue that NATO's dodged the bullet. The Netherlands has got Geert Wilders' party as a leading party, but the coalition that's been formed, clearly is still a sort of pro-NATO party. you've got, in Italy, the Fratelli d'Italia, but with a prime minister who turns out to be very transatlantic. France may still have a centrist prime minister with the socialists and the moderate left. So some of the more sort of, the extreme nationalist sort of groups have made a lot of noise, but so far, the right wing that's remained pro-Atlantic, funnily enough, has seemed to got the upper hand as to the extreme nationalist groupings. Even Viktor Orban, despite his freewheeling diplomacy, is not talking about withdrawing from NATO. And as I said with Trump, last time round, yes, we had a lot of noise, but at the end of the day, the Pentagon got on with the exercises. American troops came to Europe. The Pentagon spent money building infrastructure in Poland and so on, and life went on. Trump didn't do some big deal with Putin over the heads of NATO, so no panic. But I do feel that for an alliance based on democracy, liberal values, the biggest danger now is the internal danger of political fragmentation, political instability, putting up sort of psychological political borders, rather than the more traditional sort of external aspect of NATO policy making, and that's something that will have to be watched. And and Trump, of course, is going to be a key factor there. But Trump is contradictory, and lately he's been sort of making quite positive noises about Ukraine. So we'll have to wait and see. I mean, if he appoints Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, who are sort of responsible sort of adults, that might be a positive sign. But it's this sort of domestic uncertainty, I think, which would trouble me foremost.
I hope it's not too much to ask that the Trump administration will be full of responsible adults. Jamie, thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate. Thank you, Catarina.
Thank you for staying on that side and listening to my conversation with Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow for Peace, Security and Defense at Friends of Europe and former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. If you want to comment on this episode, you can search for Friends of Europe on LinkedIn X or send us an email. Our address is press@friendsofeurope.org. As always, don't forget to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode of Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Vila Nova, and I'll be with you again next week. Until then, goodbye.